Welcome to Enkindle Ministries, and thank you for downloading our podcast. Support for this podcast comes from your generous gifts and donations. You can find out more about the team at www.enkindleministries.org. Enkindle Ministries desires to bring revival to the Church of America by igniting His power, experiencing His presence, and inspiring His people. So grab your Bible, sit back and relax, and join us as one of our revivalists takes you on a journey through their life in the Word.
We began a study in James, and it led us into chapter 2, and this is the final study in that first section of chapter 2, which closes out the first part of an overall large section. James, you can pretty much divide his book up in half. The first half being chapter 1, which is a large introduction on the message which is given to the global church of his day. James has been given this platform as the leader of the church during that time period. It's a very infant church. The Gentiles have not come in yet. There's a lot of Jewish language that's not explained, which is one of the challenges for studying James, because it is old covenant language that they were familiar with, that has now been fulfilled, not in duty or action, but in their heart. They've been transformed by the message. And so James is addressing this church that is primarily without Gentiles. Paul hasn't been converted yet, he may have been converted, but he hasn't actually begun this big push with Barnabas to bring in the Gentiles. So chapter 1 is this message to that church. And the first half of the chapter is dedicated to detailing out the message. The last half of the first chapter is how that message is not just a checklist of what we need to do as Christians, but it's showing how that message transforms you as a person. That God, moving from the outside to the inside of you, He transforms you. It's not that I just do different things. I feel different. I see different because of God in my life. That's chapter 1. When you get into chapters 2 through 5, that's the second half of his book, which is, of course, a larger half, but that's the second half of his book, where he talks about issues in the body, and how the message of chapter 1 that transforms you, how that confronts certain issues within the synagogues, which is within their Jewish communities. It's hard to say that you're going to find these issues within the church, but it's how because they don't have necessarily church, they have synagogues they're still meeting in that cultural context. But this message confronts specifically these issues in a group of people. The first issue that he deals with is the issue of partiality, which we don't really talk much in that terminology in the church today, but it was a term that was very familiar to those in the Old Covenant. Consistently in the Old Covenant scriptures, and even we find referenced 3 or 4 times in the New Testament, this word partiality in its basic understanding is God is not partial, and if you're going to be in league with Him, filled with Him, sourced by Him, you're not going to be partial. And the idea of partiality is not to view people off of their outward countenance, but to see them through the eyes of Jesus. The outward countenance is not only looks, though it can be. In fact, in verses 2 through 7, James associates partiality and gives an example of it with viewing rich over against poor. So that's really outward. a guy that has money versus a guy that doesn't have money. That would be an example of partiality. It could also be looks, the good-looking person versus the not good-looking person, or the smart person versus the one that's not so smart. So those are all examples of partiality. But partiality runs deeper even than that. It has to do with reputation, past circumstances, and we see that really. That seems to be the deeper emphasis as you get down further in this first section. That you look at the guy that has committed murder. To show partiality would be to label him as a murderer. It's to take the actions that he's done and naturally assign them as his identity. And Jesus never does that. Jesus never does that. He has a plan and a purpose for your life, and Jesus is not the accuser. That's the enemy. Jesus is the one who constantly reminds you of who he created you to be, which is just incredible. So the issue of partiality is this is just a phenomenal section. It's the difference between seeing the way God sees and seeing the way that essentially the enemy sees. God does not show partiality. He does not look at the sexually immoral and label them sexually immoral. He looks the sexually immoral and calls them out of sexual immorality. He looks at the murderer, does not label them murderer. He calls them out of murder. And so he does not show partiality. He refuses to see you in any way other than his plan and intention for your life. So that is reflected in the body. If Jesus lives in me, he's sourcing my mind, he's sourcing my heart, meaning he's opening my eyes so I see the way he sees. He's opening my heart so I feel the way he feels. Then I also make those kinds of judgments. That's chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. That's the whole section on partiality. And as I just said, he exposes the issue of partiality in verse 1. He gives you examples of it in verses 2 through 7. And our context is going to be in verses 8 down through verse 13, where he gives basically several different kinds of people. And it could be as much as 5. He gives 5 different kinds of people that are examples of 2 spiritual conditions. Now, verses 8 through 13 only has 2 spiritual conditions: those who operate in partiality and those who do not operate in partiality. Those who operate out of the perspective and heart of God, and those who don't operate out of the heart and perspective of God. And so he illustrates these 2 spiritual conditions with different kinds of people. The 2 spiritual conditions are introduced in verses 8 and 9. Verse 8 is the guy that operates not out of partiality, and verse 9 is the guy that operates out of partiality, and they're contrasted. You see that in the language. He says in verse 8, if you really keep the royal law found in Scripture, love your neighbor as yourself, you're doing right. So if you do this, you're right. Verse 9 is, but if you show favoritism, so if you do this, then you're a lawbreaker or wrong. So verse 8 and 9, the guy that does not operate out of partiality, verse 8, is contrasted with the guy that does operate out of partiality, verse 9. And then that is expanded as you go down from verse 10 down through verse 13. In fact, verses 10 and 11 is a different guy, but he's the same spirit as verse 9, which is the one who operates out of partiality. And we've called verses 10 and 11 the justifier, that he justifies his lifestyle, and he is the legalistic individual. And we're going to reference him as an illustration here just in a minute when we get down into verse 13. By the time you come down to verse 12 and 13, again, these are 2 different people, again, it would seem, but it's the same 2 spiritual conditions. Verse 12 is the spiritual condition of the guy who doesn't operate out of partiality, and verse 13 is the guy who does. And we're going to be focusing on verse 12 and 13, but really we're just focusing on verse 13. And this has been I've only shared this study really one other time. I did share it another time, but it was more in a morning devotional, and it never comes out the way I want it. So maybe you guys could help me with it, because it seems to be it's difficult to understand, because verses 12 and 13, when we're dealing with those who are walking and living in partiality, they're walking and living self-sourced. Excuse me. It's really complex. Verses 12 and 13 come down to judgment, and judgment in at least in our culture, and I found this reflected in the NIV really strong, which is a terrible translation of verse 12 and 13. The NIV seems to focus on, excuse me, 12 and 13 seems to really focus on a final judgment, as reflected by the NIV, which is not at all what's really going on in the passage. And it's a mistreatment of some unfamiliar or rare language, I would say, that's used. There's some language construction, some grammar construction in verse 13 specifically. It's so rare that there's differences of opinion on how you translate it, and because of that, there's theological translations. People naturally assume that they're going to translate this the way they kind of according to their own doctrine, and so we're going to try to straighten some of that out, and then I'd really like some time to talk about it. Verses 12 and 13 deal essentially with the idea of judgment, and there are two different Greek words for judgment that have the same root, but they're different in endings, and those endings seem to dictate how they're used throughout the New Testament. Those three words for judgment are krino, krima, and krisis. And they all seem to have different emphasis. And if you're, excuse me, if you're writing this down, or taking notes on this, especially those of you in class, it might be helpful just to write krino, K-R-I-N-O, krima, K-R-I-M-A, and krisis, K-R-I-S-I-S. Krino, krima, krisis. Those are three different Greek words for judgment, two of which are used in our passage. These words for judgment, krino, is the type of judgment that are decisions made, it's decisions made in a judgment. And maybe I should explain it by giving you an illustration. A guy comes over to my house, a young kid from the church, and I want him to mow my yard. And he mows it, but he runs over some flowers that I just planted. He throws some rocks through a window in my car, and he leaves all the grass on the walkway, and just, that's how he did it. Just did some things that were not good. Krino would be, I'm going to make a decision on how this guy, I'm going to judge how he mowed my lawn when I come out to pay him. And krino are the decisions that make up that judgment. So I come in afterwards and I tell my wife, man, I'm never having that kid mow my lawn again. And she says, why? And I would express why through krino, which are the decisions by which I made that judgment. Well, he threw a rock through my window, he didn't sweep off the walk, and he ran over some flowers. That's the krino judgment. Those are the decisions that I made in coming to a conclusion if he's going to mow my lawn anymore. Now, krima is taking all of the krino, those decisions, and coming to a sentence where I look at the guy and I say, I make a judgment. You didn't do a good job, which is what I tell my wife. Hey, how did he do? Well, he did this, this, and this. That's krino. And it led me to krima, which is a sentence. The guy did a terrible job. Now, krisis is the final word for judgment, which is a labeling of how that young man mows a lawn, which is a final and that word krisis seems to be used consistently. And I would just say it is used consistently in the New Testament for slapping a label on someone. And it's usually used in connection with people. So I would say this guy is a terrible lawn mower, a mower, a guy who mows your lawn. And in fact, somebody asked me about this guy, and I immediately come to krisis. Oh, don't have him mow your lawn. You know, I've made a judgment about him. That's made up of the krino, which brings me to the sentence, which labels the guy, which is krisis. All right, those are the three words for judgment. So I hope you have those memorized. We're gonna look at them. Now, the judgment in verses 12 and 13 is really on. It's the judgment itself is on trial in verses 12 and 13. In other words, should we? It's not bad to make krino and krima. In the New Testament, you're not condemned for making krino or krima. You need to remember that. Having decisions that lead you up to a krima, the krino leading up to a krima is not bad. It's the krisis that God alone can do, which is the labeling of somebody, and he does not do it except for a final future time. That is after death. And what stands in opposition to krisis, which is this final irrevocable judgment, we don't live in the hour of krisis while we're here on this earth. We do not live in the hour of krisis. We live in the hour of mercy. And mercy is a really, it didn't mean what I thought it meant when I really got down to studying the term and how it's used. Mercy is not forgiveness. Mercy is not labeling a person. It's not exonerating them. It's not even really forgiving them. It's not making excuses for them. Mercy is saying, I know you've done this. I know it's wrong. In other words, I know these are the things you've done, krino, and it's wrong. I've passed a sentence on that, krima, so what you've done is wrong, so I haven't exonerated you, but I'm not going to krisis. I'm not going to give you over to that. See, the guy that's done murder, yeah, that's what you've krinoed, and it's wrong. There's krima. That's not correct behavior. But I'm not going to call you a murderer because that's not who you are. That's not who God has created you to be, and I'm not leaving you with that label. I'm not writing you off. I'm going to show you mercy, which means I'm going to jump right in the midst of your circumstances. I'm going to walk right in the midst of the decisions you've made that are absolutely improper, that are absolutely wrong. That hey, we're not going to stand this. I'm not just going to overlook it. But we're getting you out of this. I'm not leaving you to your own devices. You are not a murderer. You are not you are not a thief. You are not a liar. I will not call you that. I refuse to see you like that. That I am not going to come in league with the accuser, which is the enemy, and label you that. I'm going to see you as Jesus sees you, and every time you see me, every time you come in contact with me, I'm going to be that physical person that reminds you of who you really are, which is not what you're doing. That's the idea of mercy, which is really, really cool. That is the example of the person that does not show partiality in its perfected form. The guy that does not show partiality is James begins, if you remember, back in verses 2 through 7, with such rudimentary illustrations. The rich and the poor. We would say the beautiful versus the not beautiful. That's so surface level that I'm not going to make judgments about you or I'm not going to like you because you're good looking. See, that's all surface level. Where James is really wanting to take us is at the heart level of our lives, the inside integrity, character level of how we interact with people. That we are to be merciful, which is man, there's always hope. That there's always a person that says, man, I'm not going to leave you to your own actions, and I'm not going to see you in that way. That's the idea of mercy. Now, the illustration of that, that's the one who's not partiality. It does not show partiality. See, the person that is partial does show partiality. He automatically defaults to the outward face. He defaults to looking at what you've done and labeling you like that. Looking at assigning self-worth to your activities. You're a rich person. You're good looking. You're a murderer, whatever. He defaults. So that's the difference between partiality and not being partial. Now, the concept, which I want to illustrate for you just real quickly, we see this over and over and over with Jesus. And all of us on this conference call, we've got our own illustrations. Probably, if you're like me at least, there's things that I don't tell anybody about. There's aspects of the real Jeremiah, both past and probably present, that Jesus only knows about. And he's pulling for me. Jesus is Team Jeremiah. He's not partial. He's not the accuser. He's merciful. He's compassionate. He shows concern, care, pity. He doesn't leave me to my own devices, my own decisions that I've made. He's constantly reminding me of who I am and who he called me to be. We see this in several illustrations, and I'll just give you one quickly, which I think is wonderful. It's the woman caught in adultery. And it's really an interesting passage in John chapter 8, because scholars tell us that probably wasn't even included in the first manuscripts of John, that John might not even be the real author of that. He probably is, but let's just say for the sake of argument that he's not. Whoever added that in there as perhaps even a true story, which I believe it is, they've taken the whole concept of holiness, of sourcing, and they've illustrated that on their own through us. They've made the connection, and they stick this scene right in the midst of John in the context of chapter 7 through 12, where Jesus is dealing with the leaders of Israel who are just merciless, and they've stuck this passage right in there, and it's just it's phenomenal. This woman's caught in adultery, the very act would have been Crino. That's the decision she made, and they drag her to Jesus, and they're Crema. They're making a sentence on her. She was caught in the act of adultery, and they're going to pass sentence. And the idea of killing this woman, stoning this woman, is the krisis idea. It's the final, irrevocable decision that defines her life. She was killed because she was an adulterer. And Jesus, though he doesn't refute the Crino that she was, committing adultery, he doesn't refute the Crema that, she's guilty, that's not correct. Hey, he doesn't have a beef with that. Where Jesus stops short is with the krisis, that I'm not leaving her to that. And the way he accomplishes that is to call the crowd out of partiality. He says, listen, hey, if you guys have no Crino, nothing, the actions you've done that are Crema, which are wrong, if you had none of that, you guys do it. You go ahead and cast the first stone. And none of them, he basically pulls the crowd out of krisis. He pulls them out of finalizing this woman's existence to this act and locking her to that in death, which is a beautiful illustration of what James is trying to get at in this passage. Now, we're going to focus on verse 13 just for a brief moment. I want you to consider it, and I hope the whole idea of judgment Crino, crema, and creasus makes sense. When you walk into verse 12 and 13, again, the two spiritual conditions are contrasted. Verse 12, the spiritual condition is that of Jesus, the one that's sourced by God. He's the one that back in verse 8 has been righted. He's seeing the way Jesus sees. He feels the way Jesus feels. He's not showing partiality. He's not the accuser. He is the one that shows mercy. And he's the one that says, speak. This guy speaks and acts as one that is judged by the law that gives freedom. And the idea of judgment there is that of the crino. And the crino is the decision making. And so this guy speaks and acts by the decisions he makes in his life is guided by this love your neighbor as yourself. So it flows into the way he talks, and it flows in the way he lives. Man, he's just, and the speaking and acting, you understand, the crino, we typically look at the decisions you make as bad, but with this guy, the decisions he makes are good. And it's the way he talks to people and the way that he lives his life, which is all unscripted. It's not religious. And so the verse 12 guy, which is a whole prior study, which we don't have time to go in fully, that's the idea, that this one is not showing partiality. Now, contrast with that is verse 13, and this is the one individual who is showing partiality, and they have not been merciful. And it reads, because judgment without mercy will be shown to anyone who has not been merciful. Mercy triumphs over judgment. First idea in the passage is the idea of association. And it's really a grammatical exercise that needs to be done. That there is an association with this guy that he has with judgment. And the judgment in verse 13 is the creasus idea. Now, the guy that's presented in verse 13, we're calling this the association because he is associated with judgment. And again, the way that my NIV translates this, it would seem to be that we're referring to, and you see this in verse 12 as well, the way the NIV translates it, you would assume that we're talking about a final judgment. Hey, you got to speak and act as those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom. Like, hey, you better act right, better speak and act right because you're going to be judged. But again, there's wordy problems, even in our English translation, by the law that gives freedom. And the law that gives freedom is loving your neighbor as yourself, which how in the world would that fit in a final judgment? Which should have let the translators know that verse 13 is not talking about a final judgment. See, the judgment that's going on in verses 12 and 13 is right now, that there's the judgment that we're associating with one another is happening now. It's not this final kind of judgment. And so the judgment in verse 13, as suggested by the NIV, is that if you judge, if you don't speak and act correctly, then judgment without mercy is going to be shown to anyone that's not been merciful. So it almost makes it sound like if you act out of partiality and you judge without mercy, well, one day God's going to judge you without mercy, which is retarded. God doesn't judge without mercy. I mean, that's so incredible. It supports the idea that rendering of the passage supports the idea that God sends people to hell. When the whole tone of the New Testament, John 3:16, the most famous verse in the New Testament. We all learned it as a kid, that Jesus did not come to condemn, but to save. He doesn't come to send you to hell. God comes to save you from going to there. He's done everything from birth. You were born forgiven while we were yet sinners. He saved us. And, man, at some point we all made the decision that Adam and Eve did, and we rebelled. And he's come after us ever since and said, listen, you don't have to go down that path. You don't want to go there. Life without me is hell. So the whole idea that if you judge without mercy, one day God's going to do that to you, that's the idea that if you if you pick on your little sister, then God's going to come and pick on you. Well, that God isn't like that. And that's not what's going on in this passage. So what's going on here is not describing a future judgment, but it's taking the one that has not been merciful, and it's showing how this guy is associated with judgment. Now, the grammar here, which is difficult to get a hold of, is dealing with what they call a dative construction. Now, if you don't know what a dative is in the Greek language, it's basically your indirect object. And there's 7 different dative constructions in the New Testament, which tells us a few things. It tells us that there are not only 7 dative constructions, but that the dative construction, in which there are 7 in the New Testament, is used in a variety of ways to describe how 2 things are linked together. That's what a dative is. Again, it's commonly used in the New Testament as an indirect object. You guys know what an indirect object is. You have a subject, verb, direct object, and then an indirect object. The subject, verb, and direct object is easy. The boy is a subject. He hit, which is the verb, and the object of the hitting is the direct object. That is the action of the main verb in which the boy performs. The boy hit the ball, subject, verb, direct object. The indirect object is the to his friend, and the to his friend is the indirect object, which is casualty. It's an association in the passage with the action of the verb. He's not a direct result. He's not receiving the action. He's a result of the action. So we all know what an indirect object is. The boy hit the ball to his friend. To his friend is the indirect object. His being the adjective describing the indirect object. Okay, so that's how datives are basically used in the New Testament. But there are other kinds of datives. There are what they call the possessive dative construction. In John chapter 1, verse 6, and just to give you a quick example of this. Let me see here. John 1:6. There came a man who was sent from God, and then the possessive dative construction is his name was John. And the possessive dative construction gives clarification to the one who was sent, which was John, or the man who came. And the man who came is the direct object, which is the action of the sending by God, which is the subject. So God sent this man, and then John adds, for clarification, a dative construction, which assigns the man who came, it assigns the name John to him. And so that would be an example of a possessive dative construction. So, woo, ain't this fun? Okay, now, but the one in our passage, can't wait to get to the talk on this. You guys are just going to be loving all the dative stuff. The dative construction that we're dealing with in our passage, and this is so cool, is what they call a spherical dative. Oh, you're going to love this. The spherical dative that's going on in our passage, it shows the association that this one who has not been merciful has with judgment. So the one who has not been merciful, he is associated with judgment. And we call it a spherical dative because it literally means the man who has not been merciful, he operates in a sphere, and I rather use the word haze. He operates in a haze of judgment. That's his association. In other words, the person that does not show mercy, that guy literally lives in an attitude of judgment. And the judgment he's talking about here, again, is the focus on a final and irrevocable decision. In other words, this guy does not have mercy, which is understanding, which is being partial or not being partial. It's man, I'm not going to leave you to your devices. I'm going to reach in the midst of your circumstances. See, the guy who refuses to do that, he walks around and labels people liar. And from that point on, he just, every time he sees you, man, that's who you are. He can't help it. He's trapped by that. Now, quickly, in verses 10 and 11, John expounds on the lawbreaker, which is in verse 9. And verses 10 and 11 is the legalistic individual, and he is actually a lawbreaker, but he justifies it by the law, and there's a whole sermon on this. But it's really similar because, again, this is the spiritual condition of verses 10 and 11 is the same spiritual condition of verse 13. It just manifests itself differently. Verses 10 and 11 is the religious guy, and in his partiality, in his legalism, he's bound to legalism. See, he's the guy that goes into the service, and the movement of God is powerful. God is working. But this guy that's bound to legalism, he walks out of the service, and the only thing he can talk about is how the kid in the front row was wearing his ball cap. And he's so bound to legalism. He operates in the sphere of legalism. Now, that's not the language that's used in verses 10 and 11. That's reserved for verse 13. But it's the same spiritual condition, that when you're not operating in Jesus and you're not operating out of his source, whatever you operate out of binds you. And we've got to get that. So you can, religion's not sourced by God. So if you operate out of religion and you're sourced by religion, you are literally going to be dominated and operate in a sphere of religion. See, if you're legalistic, you're going to be bound and you're going to operate out of legalism. That's the only thing you're going to see. Well, verse 13, the guy hasn't been merciful. He's bound and he operates in a sphere of judgment. See, whatever you operate in outside of Jesus, it literally defines you, and it dictates how you see and how you interact with people. So when you don't show mercy and you don't embrace not being partial, you're going to be bound to this idea of judgment. So the guy in verse 13, he has an association with judgment, which is not talking about how God's going to judge this guy in the future. This guy here who has not shown mercy, he's not merciful. This guy is bound to merciless judgment. This guy operates out of judgment. That's his association. Which leads you to the assumption that this guy makes. In every situation, because of the way he sees, he naturally assumes that your actions are exactly who you are. Operating in this haze of compassionless, merciless, by the way, in the passage, we translate that phrase, judgment without mercy, which is not, the without shouldn't be there. It's mercy is an adjective describing judgment in the passage. And so it's literally mercy without it's merciless judgment. And in the NIV, will be shown is not in the passage. In fact, the New King James doesn't do much better. The New King James says, for judgment is without mercy. There is no is there. There's no verb there. So he's not talking about judgment is without mercy. It's saying merciless judgment to the one. That's the dative construction. Merciless judgment it's almost like is handed over to the one who has not shown mercy. So the guy that does not show mercy, he's handed over to, what has captivated him, what has assumed his character and identity is merciless judgment. That's the emphasis in the passage. So this guy naturally, when his association with judgment, it makes him assume, he makes this consistent and constant assumption that he makes a constant assumption about people that that's who they are, which is not how God sees us. And I want to skip to the last one really quickly, because I want to leave about 10 minutes for us to talk about this. But he ends the statement in verse 13 that mercy triumphs over judgment. And that's exactly how you should read it. It's almost this flabbergasted statement that judgment never, ever accomplishes what mercy can accomplish. In fact, the word triumphs is actually the word laughs at, it, which is hysterical. It laughs at, it brags against judgment. That, hey, having mercy on your children means you look at your son who you've just caught in lying, and you say, hey, the crino, you lied. The crema, it's wrong. But I'm not going to sentence you as a liar. I'm going to have mercy on you. I'm going to reach into your life and say, you're not a liar. And I'm going to pull you out of that. And judgment is looking at your son and saying, you're a liar. From now on, that's how I label you. And that there's no redemption in that. There's no movement of God in that. That is a judgmental accusation in which the enemy takes upon our life. And when we embrace partiality, we fall in league with the enemy, and his perspective sources our heart and mind in how we relate to people. You know, there's a danger, Lord, in all of this. We know that your intention with not being judgmental was never to leave us in our own depravity and death and separation from you and pain and hurt both to ourselves and to others. You came to pull us out of all of that. So showing mercy is the key of it's the crux of salvation, and we know that, and you've expressed that in my life. And Father, I think what's on my heart more than anything in these moments and in these days is that I would not use your mercy as a license to sin and as a license to remain who I am, because you're so understanding, and you know you're not going to judge me, and the world has the T-shirts "Only God Can Judge Me," and it's a license to continue to live how they want to live. And man, I want to take your mercy and not treat it cheap, but I want to link hands with you. And Lord, we both to the one who's caught up in sexual immorality and drugs and alcohol and theft and money and all of this stuff, along with the person that's trapped in legalism and bound in their own self-righteousness. Jesus, we want to be you to them, and just pray that you would accomplish that. We love you. You're so merciful. You're just beyond description. In your name we pray. Amen.